On this episode is Still Loading, Fight Magic Items. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today on the show, I have a wonderful guest with me. We are going to be talking about a book of his that released pretty recently. He is the Hugo Award-winning founder of A Dribble of Ink. He is an author, a journalist, and an editor whose work can be found in Wired, Fanbyte, Electronic Gaming Monthly, Kotaku, and many more. Today on the show, I have Aidan Moher. Aidan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. This is such a pleasure.
Thank you for coming on. I'm so grateful that I got to speak to you. I talked to you a bit off mic about how much I love your book. And just for full disclosure, listeners, I did receive a review copy of this book, but not going to bury the lead. I can honestly say this is well worth the read. And as we go through this episode and this interview, I hope you'll find out why. So to kick things off, Aidan, I wanted to probably get a question that you've been asked a lot, but just so my listeners can get to know you a little bit more. What was the spark that made you want to write this book? I guess to really quick preface it for the listeners, Fight Magic Items is a book that just came out recently and is a history of the rise of JRPGs in the West. And what I want to know, Aidan, is what kind of sparked this interest in writing this book and assembling all of this info that you got here?
Yeah, so I mean, the spark for it really goes back all the way back, like to the beginning in my childhood when I grew up in a household where my mom was a voracious reader of epic fantasy science fiction. My dad was he's a writer, but also an early adopter of tech. So we had computers, we had the internet, we had uh, video games in our house for as far back as I can remember. It was just always been part of my life, and so I grew up, and those were the two streams of interest in my life. I read voraciously like my mom, but I was also into video games and computers and technology, and they were sort of in parallel paths for a lot of my childhood. Like I read a lot of books. I played a lot of video games, but they didn't really cross paths. I was playing Super Mario Brothers. I was playing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, action platformers. I was reading stuff like Jurassic Park or Tom Swift or Lord of the Rings, these big kind of chunkier science fiction fantasy books. But then one night, my parents were out. They hired a cool babysitter. He was like a 16-year-old. We'd always play video games together. We had always played stuff like Doom or Wolfenstein 3D together after my little brothers went to bed. But this time he brought over a new game to put in my new Super Nintendo called Final Fantasy 3. And that was an instant where I was like, oh, this is it. Like, this is video games and books. This is this big epic story with all these characters, this rich plot, tension, conflict. Like, the story goes on just like the same way that, you read a book, you put it down, you pick it up the next day and you pick up where you left off. I was like, this is it. This is like my two interests coming together. And from that point on, I was just obsessed with Japanese RPGs. And so, growing up, I'd always been a writer in some capacity. It came from just my family was a family of writers, and so I was always writing. By the time I graduated university in about 2007, I started a book blog, which you referenced at the beginning of the show.
Yes,
called A Dribble of Ink. Yeah, so I started that on a whim, and I did all the book blogging stuff, reviewing interviews, breaking news, all that kind of stuff for several years, and it was fairly successful. It went and won a big award, a Hugo Award. But eventually I decided it was time to move on. I had kids. My life was changing. And so I closed A Dribble of Ink and wanted to move on to just do freelance writing. So I did freelance writing about books, continuing to do book reviews and book coverage. But there wasn't a lot of money there. I was finding that I was, writing a lot and getting paid little. And so I decided I wanted to reverse that and give a try at games journalism. And so my first pro piece of games journalism was about the connection between books and video games. And so it was a piece for Kotaku about how there's a generation of science fiction and fantasy writers right now who
Hmm.
are just as inspired by, Hironobu Sakaguchi, who created Final Fantasy, Yuji Horii, who created Dragon Quest, just as inspired by them as they are by Ursula Le Guin or J.R.R. Tolkien. And so I
Yeah.
interviewed a ton of people and had this, this big piece, this big article looking at that connection and how rich it is, the connection between books and video games. And it really resonated with people, and that was a point where I was like, oh, okay, I think I can kind of tap into this connection between these two worlds. And it sort of stood to reason that JRPG still kind of represented the coming together of those. Like, they were more linear in the way that they tell stories compared to Western RPGs, and so in
Yeah.
that way um, they were more like novels, right? Rather
Hmm.
than Western RPGs, which were a little more like interactive, cooperative storytelling from tabletop RPGs. And so I just kind of like focused on JRPGs as a beat, right? I saw a bit of a niche, a bit of a hole in the market, and I said, you know what, I want to write for also people like me, people who grew up playing these games. And so I focused on Japanese RPGs, and I wrote a few pieces. I wrote about Lunar, Silver Star Story Complete. I wrote a big, long history of Chrono Trigger called Timeless. And I published a few of those. And then a friend, a kind of professional friendship between myself and someone named Eric Smith, who was an author and an agent, popped up
Hmm.
because he loves Japanese RPGs and he kept reading them. He's like, hey, this is me. Are you writing these specifically for me? And so eventually he and I, we were just friends on Twitter at first. And then he was like, wait a second, you've written enough of these. I think there's a book here. And so, we went back and forth and explored that idea. And eventually I signed with him as my agent. And that was our first project. Write and put out a book about Japanese RPGs and their history. Initially, the idea was to collect a bunch of my essays and professional pieces and put them together. But as I started doing that, I was like, no, there's a bigger story here. There's like an actual narrative. There's actual like themes and connections running through this that would be really compelling in a larger piece about the history of Japanese RPGs, but not just the history of Japanese RPGs, but like the story of how like me and my friends who grew up in like a small island community in British Columbia were influenced and overtaken by these sort of odd Japanese games, like reaching us
Yeah.
from, across the other side of the world, across the other side of the Pacific. Like, what happened to make that, like, come together? Why Japanese RPGs? And so that's what the book looks at. It looks at the history, the beginnings of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest as they sort of created the subgenre of Japanese RPG. It looks at how they sort of like came over to the West and became successful. But it's also a story about people, and it's I say it's about it's a story. It's a book about Japanese RPGs and the people who created them and play them. And so at the core of this is this experience that I had growing up, discovering these discovering these games, but also the experiences of the actual creators who made them. What drove them
Yeah.
to create these games? Why did they want to make them in the way that they did? And so I really wanted to bring those human stories into the core of the book, that emotional journey that we've gone on as fans and the creators have gone on as they've created and iterated on this genre that so many people love.
That sparked a whole bunch of questions that popped in my head. So I want to try to tackle them
Mm-hmm.
in kind of the order they came up through your kind of history of going through your love of JRPGs up until to writing the book. Um, so the first question that came up when you closed your Dribble of Ink and then you started freelancing as a games journalist, what was the biggest difference you noticed between doing science fiction and fantasy blogging and editing and reviews versus what it is in games journalism?
Yeah, I mean, the number of platforms is just bigger. Like, games it's a huge market right now, and so there's a lot of high end professional sites that are looking for freelancers
Hmm.
and publishing a ton of content. Whereas in science fiction and fantasy, there's just there's Tor.com, there's IO9, um, but even places like Tor.com aren't paying pro rates, or they weren't when I was writing for them.
Yeah.
And so like you just like video games as this kind of grown into this huge like media empire, they have sort of the press to go along with it. And so I was finding that there's just more editors working looking for video game pitches. There's more, like, they pay better. as well. They don't pay, I wouldn't say that video game journalism pays great, but it paid a lot better than science fiction and fantasy did. And at the time I was making the transition
Hmm.
as well, like blogs were still a thing. And so like, lots of us, myself included, were putting out a lot of this work for free. We're writing it, we're putting it out on our blog for free. And so I didn't necessarily see the opportunity to like go deep into video game writing on the blog or in that ecosystem that I had set up at that point. But I did see a lot of, like calls for submissions from editors on Twitter, from gaming
Yeah.
editors and stuff. So it just seemed like an appealing sort of jumping off point, to make, to write a little bit less and, like make a little bit more money. And it did sort of prove that. But then then the pandemic hit. And so there's
Hmm.
been a lot of ups and downs. When the pandemic hit, nobody was buying anything, right? Like nobody had budget. So my first piece came out in about halfway through 2019. And so, like 8 months later, like nobody was buying anything. So
Yeah.
that was tricky. So then I kind of had to wait that out. And then I've gone on to sell like, a bunch of pieces, and but then, you're also, video game media is also going through a tough time. There's been a lot of site closures, like magazines and websites just shut down,
Or
or
just like
massive
shrinking.
layoffs
Yeah,
as well.
layoffs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's made it tough, for freelancing also, because you have fewer venues, so you have fewer pieces, you have fewer room for freelance. Um, Budgets are staying the same, and then you also have a field of freelancers who all of a sudden is flush with all these people who have been laid off, from various media sites, and they're incredible writers because they're coming from these media sites. And
Yeah.
so the field of the pool of opportunities is smaller, and the pool of talent is denser and denser and denser. And so it's not something I can make a day job either way,
Hmm.
but it has allowed me, and what I've found so compelling about it is it has allowed me to find sort of a niche that crosses over between the two interests that I have, which is books and gaming. And I had also just, honestly, I'd written about books for almost a decade at that point. And I was, transitioning to a new place in my life. I was finding it harder to find time to read. As my kids were born and got older, I found it a lot easier to pause a video game if they needed help than to put a book down and come back to it.
I can
Or if
see
I was
that.
sort of half distracted, I could play some open world RPG like Xenoblade fairly easily because I'm sort of doing mindless stuff. Whereas books, I was more involved, or just sort of more invested in mentally and focused. And so I was playing a lot more video games, and it just sort of seemed like something new and fun and interesting to try. And so I made that leap.
Okay.
And I still write about books. I have a newsletter called Astrolabe, and I still cover books a lot. I still write about writing and books, quite regularly. So it's not something that I've left behind entirely, but I just find that freelance opportunities in games writing is just just a bit more robust than what I was finding in book reviewing.
That's
Uh,
interesting considering,
yeah,
like you mentioned, all the layoffs, and it's there's more opportunity in
yeah,
games writing despite all the layoffs and downsizing
yeah,
of games journalism and all that stuff. Another question that kind of popped into my mind: was there any major differences that you noticed between writing a book versus writing articles or editing the stories that you put up on a dribble of ink? Was there any big
yeah.
differences there?
Yeah, I mean, the big challenge with the book. So I did write it in a way that like each chapter it sort of stands alone as its own little essay, right? So like,
Hmm.
each one is structured in the way that, I might structure a freelance piece that I sell somewhere. So it's a little mini story. It provides the context the reader needs. It doesn't rely on information necessarily that they've got earlier in the book, though that might help provide, a better depth of understanding. And so, on an individual chapter by chapter basis, it was very similar. I'd come up with the concept for the chapter. Here's the story I need to tell. Here are the points I need to hit, and then I do the research or do the interviews I needed for the piece. The trick, of course, was creating the themes and the through lines throughout the whole book. So taking all of these like different games, different histories, different people, and creating a story that is cohesive and feels like it's telling a full narrative arc throughout the book. And the way that I did that, and with help from editors and with help from readers and stuff, is saying, like JRPGs are vast. Like there's so many of them. I can't write a
Yeah.
book that tells the history of every JRPG. It would be 5 times as long, and I could have written a book 5 times as long, right? And so what I needed to do was like identify like who are the key players, what are like the thematic through lines that get us from the beginning to where we are now. And so that's where like the idea, like it's the history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West came in. And so that gave me my framework. Like the beginning is about Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, and then the genre sort of expands and then it moves west. But throughout the book, we're always coming back to seeing like how are Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest doing? How are they informing the other games? How are these games in conversation with, the original two? And that gives sort of that shape to the book, that it's, like that it's following along with the impacts that these games themselves made. And then the book closes out by looking at Hironobu Sakaguchi, who created Final Fantasy, how like his take on JRPGs and Yuji Horí's take with the Dragon Quest series, they started out with a very similar idea, but they sort of like immediately split into different like
Yeah, yeah.
ways to like evolve this genre. And so looking at how that occurred up until modern times, and then looking at the final chapter in the book is looking at Hironobu Sakaguchi in the twilight of his career, making games, looking back on his career and still being like, oh, I've done all this, I've created this genre, but I can still do better. Like how can I take the lessons I've learned along the way and apply them to make the best version of the game that I can at this moment. And that that gave that shape that I needed to the book, that like really separated it from just like an essay collection, say, to
Yeah.
give it an actual like narrative that it covers over the course of from the beginning to the end.
One of the things I really enjoyed about the book, and I say this as a sincere compliment, is that your writing style is the way I think, if that makes sense. Like when I'm reading it, I could almost hear it like this is what it was in my voice almost. And one of the things I always admire about writers is it's it's easy to have those thoughts. It's easy to have like a feeling, or a game that evokes a feeling in you, or any type of media, book, movie, show. But writers are the people that are able to take those feelings and find words to express them, find words in ways that you might not be able to do it. Like you can feel it and you can feel it and you can know it, but if you try to put it into words, it just comes out as like language soup. And so what I love about your book is that you took all those emotions of mine from, I mean, we played different games. We had a different childhood growing up, but the sentiment was very similar. And the kind of feeling I got playing JRPGs as a kid was very similar. In fact, I said to you off mic, your book inspired me to get into JRPGs again. Like really, I always enjoyed them, but because they were such massive time commitments, I was always just too afraid to really press on and do something about it. So listeners, I mean, you probably have seen on my social media about doing polls and trying to see what games people would want me to play, or I'm doing my winter. I just actually, at the time this episode comes out, the winter of Final Fantasy will have concluded. It'll be like a week or two old at this point. That was something I was planning on doing at one point in time, and this book kind of kickstarted it, put it into overdrive for me. So I really love your writing style, man, where it's just it feels like my nostalgia, but in words that I could never figure out how to put on paper myself. Really, really enjoyed that. And that was more, I guess, more of just a compliment, but as in terms of a specific question for your book, I wanted to ask: Has JR like how in what way has JRPGs influenced your writing style, or have they influenced your writing style?
Yeah, and I just want to like roll back and say like I do really appreciate what you're saying about the book, because that is something that like that was a goal of mine from the beginning. I wanted it to be that like the type of book where like as people are reading it, it feels like they're sitting across from their friend at the table reliving memories
Yeah.
that they shared. And like even though we didn't play the same games, even though we didn't have the same experiences, like there's so many people like us that had those feelings, those emotions, and trying to find those emotions and bring them forward was a big goal of mine. And so like I really appreciate that. As for your question about like Japanese RPGs like influencing my writing, in addition to being like a nonfiction writer with fight magic items, I am also a fiction writer. And so like I'm working on I have like a novel me and my agent are about to ship. start shopping around. I'm halfway through another one, and they're heavily, and sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally, heavily influenced by Japanese RPGs, because those were the stories that lived in my head. Those were the stories that lived in my heart
Hmm.
as I grew up. I wrote a piece. My first piece for Kotaku was about like the community of people who were as inspired by Sakaguchi and Hori as they were by Tolkien and Le Guin, and I'm one of those people. And we medium is important, right? It helps us experience stories, but ultimately, like, stories are stories, and if they touch us and if the characters touch us, the experiences they have in the game or the book resonate with us, and they're going to stick with us and shape us, whether they're film, whether they're books, whether they're video games, whether they're anything else. And so for a long time I sort of pushed against that. When I was quite a bit younger, like, my first serious attempt at a novel was like basically like a novelized sequel to Lunar Silver Star Story Complete, or I guess
Hmm.
a sequel to Eternal Blue, with, like, the serial numbers filed off. Like, it was very much like, oh, this is a Japanese RPG in a book. But then I sort of like started growing up and started reading like Game of Thrones and more serious fantasy books as well, getting away from sort of that 80s epic fantasy, which shared a lot of motifs and structures with Japanese RPGs. They're quest driven,
Hmm.
they're like motley band of heroes taking down the evil lord. I started branching out from that, and I think there was a period of time where, like, I didn't think I was allowed to be influenced by Japanese RPGs, and so I sort of like pushed against that, right? But then, there was one specific conversation I was having with a couple of people on Twitter, and one of them was an agent, one of them was an editor at a publisher, and they said, like, I was kind of talking about like how there's this book I have, and I'm kind of struggling with it, and I know what I need it to be, but I like I don't think I can really let it be a JRPG book. And they're like, no, like, go for it. Like, if you need to write the book the way you need to write it, then that's what's going to become something special that only you could write. If you're fighting against what you want to like influence the book, like, it's never going to become something that it needs to be. And that was a conversation that freed me up to be like, yeah, okay, I can draw in things from the
Yeah.
games that I used to play. I don't it's not like my books have, like, the characters constantly going to equipment stores and buying new equipment and
Yeah.
juggling accessory slots, but the themes and the motifs, the ideas, the character archetypes, some of the journeys, like, if there's something that inspires me and it's from a Suikoden game and I really liked it, like, I can bring that forward in some way. And it fits into a different story in a different way, into a different medium in a different way. But that's no different than being inspired by, Star Wars or Dune or, anything else along the way. And so, it's fun, taking the things that you love and turning it into something new, right?
No,
And
100%.
video games were inspired by tabletop RPGs, which were in turn inspired by epic fantasy books and Lord of the Rings and stuff like that, right? So, like, you see mediums crossing
Hmm.
over and talking to each other from the very beginning. And so I don't think that there's anything reductive or, like, unsuitable about video games than influencing books. Like, it's sort of this cyclical nature, and I think it's really great that way. And I think you're seeing that more and more and more. Like, I see people, referencing Japanese RPGs in their book pictures all the time. Like, authors, there's like query contests on Twitter where you write a quick little blurb about your book and then do a comp. And I'm constantly seeing people comping, to be like, uh, Nona the Ninth crossed with Final Fantasy or whatever.
Hmm.
Like, it'll be a book or a movie and a video game, and it's all mixed together now. And I think we're moving past that point where there's like stigmatization about video games being like cultural influences. I'm really proud of the way that Japanese RPGs have shaped the books that I'm writing, the fiction books that I'm writing. And I hope, like, we'll get to a point where those books are out there and people can read them. They can see the history of the genre in fight magic items, but then they can see how the genre informs art, in some of the books that I'm writing afterwards as well.
You actually kind of answered one of my other questions I was going to ask. Like, did you think you had that hesitancy because of the stigma of video games for so long and other, like the way video games are viewed in the old guard, quote unquote, in other media? Like, I mean, he's passed now, but like Roger Ebert said, video games will never surpass movies or whatever in terms of story or something along. He didn't, that's not an exact quote, but you know what I'm saying. Like, where they're not going to be considered like a quote unquote high art like
Yeah,
movies are or something like that.
yeah,
But uh, and you kind of answered it. It was that stigma that really kind of stopped you there. I want to go back real quick when you were talking about the the vibe of the book that you're going for, where it's a friend of yours who, or you're sitting across the table from a friend sharing stories of gameplay. And I love, or of games, and I love in the beginning of your book how you talk about how you and your friends created like basically a JRPG book club in high school. Like that's just something that I I didn't have that exactly, but as a kid, I when I hit my Final Fantasy spree of 7 through 9, which I talk about in the Winter of Final Fantasy, uh, I would bring my Final Fantasy 8 strategy guide to school every day and just read it, even though I can't play it at school. But for some reason in my head, it was my friend had already played the game, so he would always kind of ask me like, oh, where are you at in this point of the game, where are you at in that point of the game? And that was always fun. So it just, once again, listener, like his book really kind of captures that feel of like schoolyard banter, like the sense of discovery with you and your friends, like trying out a game, whether it's a JRPG or otherwise. It kind of, it has a really good feel to it. Um, what I was going to ask next, though, is in terms of specifics for the book, in terms of what you researched and what you included, was it hard to figure out? You referenced that you wanted to find that through line and you found it through Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, but was it ever hard to pick and choose what you needed to include in this? Was there anything that is on the cutting room floor that you wanted to fit in that you couldn't?
Yeah, absolutely, a ton. And so like the original outline was long,
Hmm.
and had stuff that eventually got cut. Right. The original draft that I submitted to my editor was, I think it was about 122, 123,000 words. The book published at about 110, 111,000 words. So like I wrote 15,000 words, give or take 12,000 words extra. That just didn't make it into the book, and some of that was just trimming down and better writing, but other parts of it was full chapters that ended up getting cut, and some of that was just because at the end of the day, it did everything in the book needed to support that main theme of like the history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. And so the example I like to bring up when people ask about cutting room floor stuff is I really, really wanted to write about the Sega Saturn, which was a huge flop in the West, like huge, huge flop in the West.
Yeah.
Awful Japanese RPG system for Western fans, but an incredible system in Japan. Like it was so really successful in Japan, and it has an amazing library of Japanese RPGs, including like the best versions of some PlayStation classics. So like games that I played on PlayStation, like Grandia and Suikoden, you have better versions, definitely better in
Oh.
Grandia's case. Suikoden's sort of like give or take, but it what it misses out on some graphical features, it has like extra content that the PlayStation release didn't have. So you have these like classics in the West that released on the Saturn in Japan. And then a bunch of exclusives that people just don't know about. And I really wanted to write this story about how it was like this really underappreciated system. I didn't know about it. I only got a Saturn about a year ago, and so I've had a blast going back and discovering all of these games. It's like reliving the golden age again. Like having
Yeah,
find
yeah.
like, can you imagine if you found like 20 great PlayStation art JRPGs that you like had never played? Right
Hmm.
now. It's incredible. But it was such a flop in the West that I couldn't justify it as something that like buoyed or influenced the success of the genre in the West. So I
Yeah.
ended up having to cut that chapter from the book. But since then, I've managed to actually, I sold that story and wrote about that in Unwinnable, which is a monthly gaming magazine. And so I got to tell that story. And I found and I identified a lot of the stories that, like, they didn't necessarily support the overall narrative in the book, but they're interesting individual standalone stories. And so I was able to, like with a few of those, I have another one coming out hopefully this month about games localization in the 90s. And there just wasn't room in the book, and so I was able to take some of the content from those interviews and intersperse it throughout in appropriate spots in the book, and it buoyed up some of those chapters. But I had this whole great deep narrative about games localization in the 90s, and I was able to find a home for it as well. So some of these stories that didn't make it into the book, they found other homes, and so people will be able to kind of experience them and read them in addition to fight magic items, and fill in some of those holes that I really wanted
Yeah.
to tell, but wasn't right for this book. um and I at the end of the book, I talk about how like JRPGs is such a broad genre, and every
Yeah.
person has their own personal experiences, right? So somebody else who wrote this book, I write about Suikoden, and I write about Lunar and Chrono Trigger and stuff, Persona. Someone else might write this book and write about, like totally different series, right? They might, write about more about Lufia, and they might write more about the Trails in the Sky series and this and that. And I think that's what's so great about this genre, is that like no matter what our personal experiences are, I think the overall like idea behind the book of like, experiencing these stories, looking at like classic narratives, like Western inspired narratives, like we see a lot in Japanese RPGs, but through an Eastern perspective, is really interesting. And whether you played the same games as me or different games, I think everybody can kind of find that same, that same shared experience of playing these games along the way. And so like, there's games that if I wrote this book in 5 years from now, I bet my guess is that it would have a big chunk on Trails in the Sky and the Legend of Heroes story series,
Have you been
because
playing through those recently?
I haven't. I've played a fair chunk of the first one, but I've been noticing, and I own most of them, but I've been noticing that they've been gaining and gaining and gaining in popularity. And I think that, like what's happened with Fire Emblem in the
Mm-hmm.
West, where it went from sort of a niche series that some people really liked, but it was fairly small, to just sort of having this growth and explosion. I can see that happening with Trails in the Sky as more games come out. And I think, like in 5 years, I'll probably look and be like, oh, I probably could have written about Trails in the Sky, because I think it's going to have a big impact on Japanese RPGs over the next 5 years. And so like those sorts of things I can look at and be like, yeah, like I probably could have, like, I can see a book with this shape instead of that shape. But it was impossible to get every story in there without it being
Yeah.
multiple volumes, which just wasn't going to happen.
Well, I'm sure some people would have enjoyed that. I can, to something that you were saying before though, or in that last segment, that you would hope that people can still enjoy it despite not having like the same interest specifically in games. And I can tell you, I didn't play half the games that you listed. I mean, I heard of many of them just because I'm in the video game, in the video game community and the retro gaming and gaming community at large. But like, I haven't played like half of them, but I still found it incredibly interesting. And describing some of the mechanics and how the mechanics of JRPGs have changed over the years and that kind of thing. It makes it a very it makes it a super interesting read. Now, another question I had about the book though, real quick. How long did it take you to research this, and then afterwards, how long did it take you to put it all down on to write it all? To how long did it take you to write it all up?
Not long enough, to be honest. When we were, when my agent and I decided to, like, we came up with the idea, I wrote about 15,000 words. So I wrote essentially in the book, the first 15,000 words, first like 2 or 3 chapters. And that was in our pitch material. Then we sold the book, and I wrote the rest. So about 100,000 words in about 3.5 months.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, and that was to hit, that, and that was, like, with my publisher, we settled on a timeline so we could hit certain dates. We wanted to line up with, earlier this year was the 25th anniversary of Final Fantasy VII. So we wanted to line up with that. And so, yeah, the first draft was about 3.5 months, and that was writing and researching along the way. And so like, that was a lot. And that was, a bit too much. I wouldn't do that again necessarily. But what it did allow me to do was like really immerse myself in this story. And I think that allowed some of the, I keep coming back to the idea of these like ongoing or, motifs and themes in the book that kind of repeat. And I can see
Yeah.
patterns maybe a little more clearly because I was so like head deep in this history for, 3.5 months. And so I
Yeah.
delivered that manuscript, about 120,000 words, after about 3.5 months. And then we went into like a revision and editorial period. But the book, so I started writing in May of 2020, I guess. I finished in September, and then the book came out the next, no, it would have been May 2021. Finished in September, and the book came out in October. So it was a little over a year from me starting writing the book in earnest to it being on shelves, which is really quick in publishing. Usually it takes a lot longer than that. But for a variety of reasons, my publisher and I wanted to hit, like a really aggressive date, and we did, and that was hard. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. But I'm really happy with the way that the book turned out, and because it was such an intensive experience during those 3.5 months. But but yes, I'm working on another book right now, and I was just talking to my editor about deadlines and stuff, and I gave myself a little more cushion room.
Are you able to tease the book, or is it still under wraps right now?
I can't tease it right now,
Okay, okay.
but yeah, but it's a good one. Anyone who likes fight magic items will like what's going on with this book. It's something near and dear to my heart. So, you know what? In fact, it's something that I would have loved to cover more and discuss more in fight magic items, but just didn't have the space. So pretty excited about it.
On a more personal note, I was wondering. I have a couple more personal questions about your taste in gaming and whatnot. Uh, it's specific to JRPGs, obviously, since it's the whole theme of the book. First, though, I'm a relatively new dad, and you're a father as well. What would you consider to be a RPG you would want the first RPG you want your kids to play? You know, like how every parent's always like, "Oh, I got to show my kids this movie or have them read this book to them." For you, on a gaming from a gaming perspective, what game would you be like, you got to play this JRPG first? You know, obviously once they're able to read, because almost all the old ones are super heavy on text. But yeah, what would be the game that you would sit down, Junior, you're playing Chrono Trigger or whatever it may be?
Yeah, it would be Chrono Trigger.
There
That
we
would be the
go.
one. Like, if anybody follows me on Twitter or kind of follow along with any of my writing, Chrono Trigger is the game for me. It's the one that, like, I talked earlier about Final Fantasy VI being the one that like made me excited about JRPGs, but Chrono
Hmm.
Trigger was the one that turned me into, like, a lifelong devotee. It's still my favorite game. I play through it regularly. I've written extensively about it. Um, and to me, it is like this perfect slice of the golden age of Japanese RPGs, and that first golden age. In the book, I kind of like identify it's like one golden age, but I feel like it's split up into two golden ages, where you have the Super Nintendo with like Final Fantasy VI, and you have Secret of Mana, and you have Chrono Trigger, Fantasy Star 4. And then there's a bit of a lull for not very long, but as the Super Nintendo fades away, the PlayStations come, but Final Fantasy VII hasn't arrived yet. There's like a lull in there where you have some decent JRPGs, Wild Arms, Suikoden, but they're just like slightly juiced up Super Nintendo games, right? They're not really
Okay, yeah,
blowing you
yeah.
away. Suikoden and Wild Arms are like, oh, you're like, oh, the music in these is great, but otherwise, like you're like, yeah, I guess this feels like a slightly Super Nintendo game. But then Final Fantasy VII hits, and that changes the way everybody thinks about Japanese RPGs. It creates like millions of new JRPG fans, and that's sort of like the second golden age. So they seem like one golden age. I think they're two bumped up back to back. But to me, Chrono Trigger is the game that sort of encapsulates that first golden age. I think it's just a perfect, polished representation of everything that went into the 8-bit and 16-bit version of the genre. And like you had the creator of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest coming together, taking the best elements of their series and creating something that, like, there's no fat in the game. Like, it's
Yes.
super lean, but it's dense. There's so much story. There's so many, like, side quests, characters that you love. It's episodic, but there's never a good point to put it down. Like, some episodic games, it's like, Dragon Quest as an example, I think, is like, it's very episodic, but sometimes you wrap up an episode and then it's like, oh, okay, now there needs to be more story ramp up for the next episode, like the next little
Yeah.
vignette. But Chrono Trigger is not like that. It's episodic, very heavily episodic, but it also, like, the momentum just carries and you can't put it down. And in that way, I think it really exemplifies, like, okay, like, you want to know what this first two generations JRPGs were all about. This is the game. This is where you need to start. And then you can start looking at the genre as it sort of diversifies after that, because that's when you have Final Fantasy taking the genre in that direction, like other games and series going in the other direction. But Chrono Trigger just sort of encapsulates everything that I love about 16-bit JRPGs. And it's quick and easy. It's
Hmm.
20 hours long if you haven't played it before.
And for a
And,
JRPG, that might as well be like a 5-hour Call of
yeah,
Duty game.
so, yeah, exactly. It's like,
It's so
prologue to
short
some of,
compared to yeah.
yeah, it's like chapter one in a Xenoblade game, right? And so like it's short and it's relatively easy as well, which I think is appealing. If we're specifically talking about introducing kids to it. It came out in '95, so I was 11 or 12, and I think that would be a good age for it. It's got bright, colorful graphics, which I think appeal to younger people, but it's also timeless in that, Akira Toriyama way, that it just like it still looks great all these years later, 25 plus years later. So like, whether it's kids, learning about the genre for the first time, or it's people who want to go back and be like, okay, well, like I like games now. I like Final Fantasy 15, or I'm looking forward to Final Fantasy 16, or I like Xenoblade. But like, what were retro JRPGs like? I think it's the easiest one to play. It's the one that has the least amount of like friction.
Hmm.
I know on the Triple Click podcast, Kirk Hamilton often talks about friction in games, and that's the stuff that makes it feel not fun to play. Whether it's like
Yes.
the encounter rate's too high, or the difficulties feels unbalanced, or pacing is just off, or whatever. It's the kind of stuff that makes you want to put a game down to go do something else.
Yeah.
Chrono Trigger has very, very little friction. It's such a smooth experience, and I think even people who aren't enamored by the series or the genre could get in there and play that game and be like, yeah, okay, I can see what all the fuss is about, and then be
I'm
disappointed by everything else.
well, I'm with you on that. I did an episode on a friend's podcast called Tales from the Backlog, and we covered Chrono Trigger, and we're saying how it's like the perfect newcomers. Like if you want to try out JRPGs, Chrono Trigger is a really good first time RPG to try out because for all the reasons that you said, and I think on top of that, it's got one of the best soundtracks of any game. Period. And I think specifically the art style doesn't get enough. I mean, people talk about how beautiful it looks graphically for the Super Nintendo, but like really, those graphics hold up really well, really, really well. I think there's a difference between a game looking good graphically and a game being looking good like time almost timeless.
Yeah,
And if like you can look at like some Super Nintendo games that like I don't know, I'm thinking something like a Terminator game or something like that. Graphically, it looks pretty impressive for the time,
yeah,
doesn't really hold up all that well. It's kind of bland and boring, but Chrono Trigger is just perfect in
yeah.
terms of its visuals. Now, one thing you said in your response to that got me thinking. You mentioned about how there are two different golden ages, and Final Fantasy VII was kind of like it's almost like a golden age and a half because of that weird awkward period in between, like the year or two of just almost very little, and then the right and then Final Fantasy VII coming out and just blowing the doors off of every expectation that people had for JRPGs at the time. When I was reading your book, I think because I'm a little bit younger than you, so I played. I when Final Fantasy VII came out, I was 8, um, and I didn't have a PS1 at the time, and I didn't play Final Fantasy VII until probably like 11 or 12 years old, so like early 2000s, and so I didn't really have the context of how important that game was to Final Fantasy. And like I've listened to other podcasts and they've talked about Retronauts. I shout out once again, I always mention them on the show. Retronauts, I've listened to them, they talk about how important the game is, but for some reason the way you described it in Fight Magic Items really kind of clicked with me just how massive that game was in terms of success for Square and for the JRPG genre. And likewise, on the opposite for Square, how much of a flop the Spirits Within was, and how much it borderline ruined. Like I had no idea that Square had to merge with Enix because of or most likely it's I guess it's never been 100% confirmed because Japanese companies are tight lipped and whatnot. But from your book, I knew it was a flop. I remember it not being popular when I was younger, but I was always kind of like, well, I mean, okay, it didn't do well, but I didn't realize how much of a financial flop it was for Square. So to lead that long winded ramble into an actual question, was there anything that you learned during research for this book that just completely surprised you that you were not expecting to learn, whether it was something that you ultimately were able to include in the book or not? Was there something that just stood out where you just went like, holy shit, I did not know this?
Yeah, I think the one that really sticks out to me, um, is the impact that Reiko Kodama had on the genre that I was unfamiliar with as a
Hmm.
Nintendo fan. Like, I grew up with a Super Nintendo and a Game Boy, but I didn't have Sega consoles, so I was unfamiliar with Phantasy Star, and specifically like Phantasy Star 4, which, a lot of people hold up as one of the great 16-bit JRPGs alongside Final
Yeah.
Fantasy 6 Chrono Trigger, and one of its creators of not just Phantasy Star 4, but the whole series was Reiko Kodama. And as I dug in more, I was like, oh yeah, Fantasy Star was created by the guy who made Sonic, Yuji Naka, who's been in the news for all the
For
wrong reasons
other
recently, right?
things recently.
Um, and I was like, oh yeah, Yuji Naka created it. But as I dug more into the story, I was like, wow, like you have something really special here in the team that created Fantasy Star, and like Sega brought them together because they were like, hey, we can do JRPGs too, we can do RPGs, and they brought together this team, and you had people like Reiko Kodama, really, just really pushing boundaries in terms of storytelling,
Hmm.
like centering this story about this like science fiction epic or like on a woman protagonist, which at the time was and remains a big deal. It's still fairly rare in the genre
Yeah.
to have. And like digging into for like more and more interviews with her, I was like, wow, like what she brought, and one of her coworkers, Chieko Aoki, brought to this development of Fantasy Star and the sequels, like it's really shaped and really made a profound impact, I think, on the shape of Japanese RPGs now. And so like finding her story, learning more about her was probably like the biggest pleasure in the book. And like you asked me about stuff that I um cut from the book or didn't fit into the book. Her story is sort of the opposite. I started researching about the original Fantasy Star, and I was going to write a bit about Fantasy Star 4, but then the more I read about her, I was like, she needs to be in this book more. Like, I need to make more room for Reiko Kodama in this book. And so I did. And that's something that, like, wasn't originally in my first draft, was to really tell her story. And then in the end, she ended up with, a big chunky chapter about the impact that she had in the 8 and 16-bit era. And so, like, that to me was like the biggest, most sort of like fulfilling surprise that I had while writing the book. And then, of course, unfortunately, we found out that she passed away
Yeah.
earlier this year, which was
Earlier last year, technically, but
early.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry, yeah,
And no,
in 2022.
it's been
Yes,
23. So
yeah, that's right.
we're still thinking last year. I get you.
Yes, yes, yes. Early in 2022, and we only just sort of recently found out that she had passed several months
Yeah.
after the date. And so that created again, like I found and I discovered her work and discovered who she was, and the impact she's had on not just the games but the my life, in the way that she changed and shaped Japanese RPGs in a way that few other people did. And then to lose her in the same year, the
Yeah.
year the book comes out, was just tragic and heartbreaking. And so that to me was just a very emotional journey over the course of the book's release.
Uh, so specifically, just because I know your book came out last year, but what was the specific release date? Just out of curiosity, because I couldn't really. What, it came out like in May or April? Was it
Uh,
like
October, October
October?
4th. Yeah.
Wait, so it came out in October 2022.
Yes.
Oh
Correct.
wow, okay, I was completely way off of that. Okay, so yeah,
Yeah.
so it came out, and it's just kind of crazy that it's almost like it was kind of fitting in a kind of a melancholy sense that you discovered her work through this book, only to the same year that you publish, you give her this wonderful tribute in the book without knowing that you were going to give her this wonderful tribute because she had passed away before the book even came out. Um, Shout out real quick to my buddy Pat Hickey Jr. He actually got to interview her about a year or so before she passed away. And it's going to be either the book, I think the book already came out. He has a book series called The Minds Behind the Games. And so he interviews game developers who, from all different, from all in all different perspectives. So he has a generic one, which I have a copy of, just called The Minds Behind the Games. And then he has uh the minds behind the games, adventure games, and then he goes through Sega Genesis, and he goes through PlayStation and shooters, and he kind of flip-flops between like consoles and genres and whatnot. But he had Rieko Kodama on in one of his books, most likely the Sega Genesis one. And it just it was weird when she passed away. I can't say that her work ever, I never played directly a lot of her games, or I don't have a lot of formative experiences, but for some reason, just her influence on gaming in general hit me a lot harder than I was expecting it to. I was like, I think just because of the way we found out too. For listeners who don't know what we're talking about, the way it was discovered that she passed away was that when the Sega Genesis Mini 2 came out, or the Mega Drive Mini 2 came out, it was listed. She was listed in memoriam in the credits for the Mega Drive 2, and someone tweeted at one of the people at Sega, I forget exactly who, and said, hey, like this says in memoriam, like, is this correctly translated, or was it just some type of weird thing where the translation was a little bit off? And he's like, no, you're understanding it correctly. We really respected her. And it's just, I'm getting emotional just thinking about it. And I don't know why. I don't have this strong connection, but for some reason, just like you see what she was able to do so early in the games industry, it really is impressive. All right. On a less emotional and sensitive subject, I have another question for you, quick, before we start wrapping things up. And just once again, on a bit more of a personal note for yourself, what are some specific games that really personally affected you? JRPGs or otherwise, we don't have to. I know the focus of this episode has been JRPGs, but what are some games that like you played through and it really just, whether it hit you with an emotional gut punch or it really affected the way you viewed the world? What are some of the JRPGs or games in general that really just kind of influenced you the most?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about Chrono Trigger, and that's the game that has probably had like the single most profound impact on my life, just as a creator and as a fan. It's become a meme that I like Chrono Trigger among like people I interact with on Twitter, and so like that's the big one. But my first thought when you ask that question is I go back to, and I talk about this a lot in the book, but I go back to like high school when the PlayStation had come out and how like these games they were single player games, right? Like ostensibly they were meant for you to sit in a room alone and to like consume them by yourself in the same way
Yeah.
as you do a book, right? But for me and my friends, and I lucked out that like at my school, like video games were fine, they were cool, they were like totally normal, right?
Hmm.
I I don't know this, like this perception of like the video game nerd, right? Like that just was not my experience growing up. So like video games and specifically Japanese RPGs are what like me and my friends bonded over, because some of us liked books and we would talk about Wheel of Time or Terry Goodkind or whatever, but we all liked video games. We almost all like Japanese RPGs. And so we would bond over that kind of stuff. And I talk in the book about the games that really brought us together. Like I talk about sitting in my friend's dark room, like three or four of us, and him playing through his like fresh copy of Final Fantasy VII on release day. We stayed up like, almost all night playing it. And the next morning being like, Dad, I need this game. Like I need to play it,
Yeah.
but my memories are of like the social aspect of getting together with friends and having this joint experience. And the PlayStation JRPGs did that more than anything else. Like Final Fantasy VII. And in the book, I talk about like how like I grew up using this old Commodore 1702 like CRT monitor, and that's what I
Hmm.
play all my Japanese RPGs on. But it wasn't a TV; it was a small monitor. It was fairly portable, and so I would haul it over to my friend's house, and we'd set our our screens up back to back, our little 13-inch screens, and we would play our own copies of Lunar Silver Star Story Complete, and we would sit there for hours. And one of us would be further than the other, so we couldn't see each other's screen, but we just hang out, right? Like eating food and hanging out. And if somebody gets stuck, like we're kind of there to help each other out. And so like these single player games still became something that brought us together as a friend group. And so those games stick out to me, not just because of, like I was sad when certain things happened, when Aerith was, you know, what happened to Aerith happened. Like that, that was sad, but it's the memory of then going
Putting
the
up a
next
spoiler
morning.
wall 25 years
Yeah.
later.
I'm careful with it because of the remake.
Oh, that's
But
true.
like it's not just what happened with Aerith, but it's the next morning when I'm on the bus, or in my case, I rode a ferry to school, to high school every day, on the ferry with my friends being like, holy crap, guys, like what? And then rehashing that. And, like being able to relive those memories a couple days later, because I was a few days behind my friends in the game, and just reliving that and just sharing that joy and that surprise with friends is what really stuck out to me about those games. And just, really enjoying that. And like, and then after high school, JRPG sort of became, more of a singular experience for me again, right? Like there was something, like me and my friends, we all split apart, people going off to school or this or that. And at that point, I found myself falling off Japanese RPGs a little bit, right? Like I would play a lot on the Game Boy. Like they moved to sort of the portable experience, and that's a larger trend in the entire industry that I cover in the book as well. I call it the Dark Ages. But at the same time, I was finishing high school and getting a job and stuff like that. Moving from where I lived, traveling, Japanese RPGs were also disappearing off consoles. And so, they became something that was a little more private, a little more just like, I'd play on my DS or my Game Boy, but they were something that I did by myself. And then I think that's sort of come back full circle as you see more and more Japanese RPGs becoming, introducing like multiplayer elements, like, or becoming MMORPGs in Final Fantasy 14's case. And I think that's really interesting as well. And then like for specific games as an adult game, like I love the Nier series. So Nier
Mm-hmm.
like Replicant and Nier Automata or Automata. I played the original Nier when it first came out. It looked super bad, but I kept seeing, people on internet forums be like, no, this game, like it'll blow your mind. And it did. And I loved it. And like, it was bad. Like Nier is the original, especially is like, it's not a great game, but it does so many interesting things narratively, structurally. And then I loved it for 10 years. And then I played the remake in like 2021, whenever it came out. But I had never played Automata because I just loved Nier so much. And I didn't know if could you do it again?
Yeah.
But I just recently completed that. And sure enough, Yoko Taro, who created Nier, like he did it again. And like, I feel like, I'm 30, I'm 39 now, and I experienced that game and that world in a different way than I did when I was 29. And in my 20s. And so like it's been interesting to watch how those kind of emotional experiences we have with games can change over time. Like you say, like you become a parent and that changes your relationship with games and the
Oh,
stories that they tell,
100%.
right?
I mean, it
And so
changes your
like,
relationship with time.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. And that I think is all, that's all really interesting. And a game I'm playing right now, it's called Chained Echoes, and it's like this pixel art throwback JRPG
It's been getting a lot of
created by
praise
like,
recently.
yeah, it's getting a lot of praise, and it's almost solely by a single person. He outsourced, I think, some art and somebody did the music, but it's created by a single person who like very obviously loved all the games that I loved. And there's so many homages in this game that it feels like a companion almost to Fight Magic Items, in that Fight Magic Items is this like narrative history of the genre and the people who made it. You play Chained Echoes and you're like, oh, okay, here are all the things about JRPGs, like here are all the highlights from the past 25 years put into this game, but in a really thoughtful way, in a way that's like, oh, okay, this respects the source material. It's not just being cheap with its references. It's looking at how the Suikoden series and the Xenoblade series, how they sort of are in conversation with each other, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
looking at stuff like Final Fantasy VI and its story of rebellion, and again, Suikoden and its story of rebellion, and how do those talk to each other? Like, how do they exist within context? It's really smart about the way that it's like referencing and cross-talking between all these really, really popular genre titles from over the past 25 years. And so like, that's an experience that like, I'm really reveling in, because it feels like, after having just written this book, I'm like, oh, okay, and here's now like the video game version of what I had
Equivalent
just
of it,
written.
yeah.
Yeah.
The way you're kind of describing it almost makes it sound like what Stardew Valley did for like the Harvest Moon style, like slow life simulator type of games, where it took a lot of the influences of the past 20 some odd years of since the original Harvest Moon and so on,
Yeah.
and refined it to something that was obviously and still is immensely
Yeah.
popular.
And like, not a coincidence that both of them were created pretty much by a single person, because I think within like larger team environments, like not everybody has that same experience with Xenogears or Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy or Suikoden or whatever.
Hmm.
And so like, it's very, very difficult to make something that's so referential and so specifically tuned to like one idea and one set of emotions and one set of like, I don't even know what the word is, but it's like, it almost feels like you have to let one person run wild with their experiences, because they can
Yeah.
pour all that emotion into the game. And that comes back to what I was talking about earlier, that like fight magic items is like, it's my experience with Japanese RPGs. Like it touches on the games that I played. Um, it touches on the emotions that I had while playing them, but in a sense, because it's so personal, it becomes sort of universal. It becomes a human story about being touched and moved
Yeah.
by these experiences. And I think I see a lot of that in Chained Echoes.
Man, I'm getting so many more questions popping in my head, but I don't. Well, we're running out of time, so I want to. I've. mm, I have to ask that at least this one that popped in my head. You talk a lot in Fight Magic Items about the golden age of the JRPG. 16-bit specifically, obviously, then the PS1, and then obviously there was the Dark Age and the different eras, but specifically the golden age. Do you feel we're kind of coming into another, I don't want to say golden age, maybe silver age? Time will tell if this is golden or silver or at any type of like higher level of JRPG age. But like I'm just thinking back, specifically the Switch, and I guess PS4 and PS5 too. But like I'm thinking, we talked about Fire Emblem earlier, how that became super popular. I'm looking at like Square's output this generation, and you look at uh, Octopath Traveler, you look at Triangle Strategy, you look at FF7 Remake, and then I feel like there's even a bunch of others that I can't even think. Monster Hunter. Would you consider Monster Hunter a JRPG?
I'm
A
I'm
more
pretty
action
open with
based?
like, I like big buckets. To me, like genre labels like JRPG are more about like ideas and inspirations and influences. And so like
Hmm.
to me it's all like a big Venn diagram that talks to each other. And I think that like, I think you can look at Monster Hunter and it has as much JRPG influence as it might have like action RPG influence, and I don't mind it being lumped into that bucket. Well, also understanding that it's also part of like lots of other things, right? And I think that stands for a lot of games, because I think what we're seeing, and to kind of get to to partially answer your question that I think you're going to ask, is like,
Yeah, no, you're pretty
I
much answering. Is this like
yeah,
the start of another golden age, or essentially, or are we in one?
I think so. I think like you say, you never know, right? But there's been so many good games coming out lately, and there's been like a broad range of games. But I think also what we're seeing is just the sort of like Japanese RPGs, they started out being influenced by Western games, right? Ultima Wizardry. They started out here, and then they sort of like
Hmm.
created Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, and they sort of did their own parallel. They went on their own parallel path to Western RPGs for a long time, right? But what we're seeing now, as the genres kind of come back together, we're starting to see now Western games and Western creators that are influenced by Japanese RPGs. And so we have people who grew up playing Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger and Phantasy Star 4, and they're making games now and they're influenced by those. So we talked about Chained Echoes. We
Yeah.
talk about Sea of Stars, which is coming out later this year from Sabotage, and it's like it's very
I
heavily
can't wait
influenced
for
by
that.
Chrono Trigger and a whole lot of things. So we have Western creators who are creating games that are influenced by Japanese RPGs. But then we also have stuff like Final Fantasy 14, which is, like it's an MMORPG, but it's Final Fantasy. Like, can it, like, and this comes back to like your question about genre labels. Like, can an MMORPG be a JRPG? Like, I think so. Not,
I mean, on a
yeah,
technical level,
but
yes, it's an
right.
RPG
And so
made by a
like it all
Japanese
blends together.
studio.
And so like I think what we're seeing is like this sort of like cultural exchange that like split apart in the 8-bit era, and now it's sort of coming together, and we're seeing that like in terms of like Western creators making homages to Eastern games. We're seeing Eastern creators taking on Western genres like MMORPGs, and we're also seeing just a blending of like games taking ideas from all sorts of other genres, right? Like we're sort of in a place where it feels like a lot of the AAA games are all becoming the exact same game, right? With open worlds and quests and lots of like RPG mechanics. And it's hard
Hmm.
to look at something like, like what Assassin's Creed has become and not be like, yeah, like there's some JRPG in there, right? There's Western RPG stuff, there's JRPG stuff, like,
Yeah,
and so like
100%.
in that way, I think, I think the idea of there being like one defined idea of like this is a JRPG because it looks like Final Fantasy VI, I think we're leaving that behind. But by doing so, there's so much more opportunity for amazing games to come up from AAA, developers. And I could go on about how I don't think AAA game development is sustainable, and I don't think Final Fantasy can continue to be the big production that it is, will sort of
No,
like
it's not sustainable. I agree with you on
you
that.
know, but like we're also looking at crowdfunding and indie studios. So like we talked about Sea of Stars or Chained Echoes, but we also have like Ayuden Chronicle coming from the creators of
Yes, yeah.
Suikoden. They created Suikoden and it was huge, and well, it wasn't huge, but it was popular and had a
Has a
had and has a
pretty
good fan
passionate fan
base.
base. Yeah.
But then Konami sort of moved more towards just like blockbuster style AAA development, and like I mean, Konami has sunk the ship on so many of their series and
An
their
understatement,
franchise
yeah.
and their IPs, right? Um, but then like the people who created Suikoden were like, well, Konami won't let us make a Suikoden game. So let's go to the fans. Let's say like we're going to make something new. And so they went to Kickstarter and they had a hugely successful Kickstarter. And now they're making Ayuden Chronicle, which is a spiritual successor to Suikoden. And then Konami goes, oh wait, hey, those guys like Murayama who created Suikoden and Kawano who helped him create Suikoden, like they just raised a ton of money with this game that's just Suikoden with a different name. We want in on that. And now, so all of a sudden, like that crowd interest and that crowdfunding and that hugely successful Kickstarter campaign has now convinced Konami to go back and revive Suikoden. And so we're seeing like how the crowdfunding and the indie scene can kickstart that AAA development
Yeah.
um, team. And I think that like in some ways, I think we're entering a golden age in terms of like there being some incredible games out, but I also see parallels to like when the genre transitioned from standard definition consoles to HD consoles. So like when the Xbox 360 and the PS3 came
Mm-hmm.
out, and the genre sank on HD consoles because developers just, and specifically like Eastern developers, didn't really know how to transition their workflows and their processes
It's a lot.
and
It
asset
costs so
creation,
much
like
more. Yeah.
yeah, pipelines into creating HD JRPGs. And so like the genre just like almost disappeared from consoles. And I worry that we're getting to a point now where like big blockbuster style Japanese RPGs just like aren't tenable. I don't know that Square can keep making
They're probably not. I'm
multiple,
with you.
Final Fantasy 16 might be the one, but then how does Square and where do they go with the rest of the stuff? And I think that we're starting to see that they're like, oh, hey, there's a big audience and there's a big crowd for games that throw back to the original style, the stuff that made us famous. And so we get like the Live Alive remake, right?
Mm-hmm.
We get stuff like Diofield Chronicle or Triangle Strategy, which are these throwback games, which don't cost as much to make. They don't need to sell 10 million copies, right? To become successful or profitable. But they also satisfy like a lot of fans. This past year, like just
And
Square
bring
Enix
in
is
new fans, I feel
and
like,
bring in new,
too.
absolutely, yeah. And I think that so like in a way I feel like the idea of this big budget, big sweeping, like that Japanese RPGs are like the biggest genre like they used to be. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like that's just not sustainable in the AAA space anymore. But just like the Game Boy and the PSP and the DS saved Japanese RPGs during the Dark Ages, I think we're seeing that sort of with indie studios crowdfunding, sort of like creating space again for these smaller, more constrained Japanese RPG experiences. That
Almost
in
like
turn
double A
is,
titles instead of triple A titles.
yeah, exactly. And they're still good. And they're like, like there was nothing wrong with the 16-bit style of Japanese RPG. It was just that tech outpaced it and creators wanted to try new things. But like that, I say Chrono Trigger is like sort of the perfected version of 16-bit RPGs. Like use that template and add 25 years of experience to it. And we're seeing with Chained Echoes how popular and successful that can be. And so it's a really complex question. I think there's going to be a lot of change in the genre over the next 5 to 10 years. And I
I
think most of it will be positive for players and consumers.
I agree with you on that. I think I didn't even really think of it this way until you mentioned all the Kickstarters. But the reason I even thought of the question is just because of games like I mentioned, Triangle Strategy is specifically like having more tactical JRPGs, like Fire Emblem and Triangle Strategy, but then also the basically the HD 2D that Square and now Konami has kind of been like really pushing. And I guess I didn't think about that. That was more of a response to the resurgence of 16-bit themed or styled games kind of coming back in from indie creators. Whether it's, I know Stardew Valley isn't a JRPG in the technical sense. It has some mild RPG elements, but it's very much in that Super Nintendo 16-bit anime JRPG graphical style. And I didn't really kind of put this together, but it makes sense that like because of this surgence of smaller type of games, the big game devs like Square and like Konami and like whatever Nintendo to an extent with their games, they're realizing they don't have to put these gigantic freaking budgets behind games. And so what you were saying with Final Fantasy 16, I call it the Die Hard syndrome. I don't know if someone else called it, but I'm pretty sure I got it from someone. I'm not going to take credit for it, but for because I can't remember who it was, I'm going to take credit for it anyway. But the Die Hard syndrome, where it's like the sequel to whatever it is has to be bigger and better, and that can only Final Fantasy doesn't need to do that. That's the saddest part about it, because every game is so different. You could you could revert it back to something completely different, and you don't need to keep doing that. Because like with what I mean by Die Hard syndrome, if you look at the first Die Hard movie, um it takes place in a single building. All building blows up. It's this crazy action movie in a single building. Second movie, how do we up the ante? Well, this time it's a whole airport, a bigger building. It's even bigger and better. Third movie, oh, it's the whole eastern seaboard of the U.S. DC up to Boston or whatever, wherever it is. It's the whole eastern side of the U.S. Or no, sorry. Third one is New York City. My bad. Fourth one is the whole eastern seaboard, and then the fifth one is just Russia. Like they just keep like taking this area and just exponentially expanding it. And arguably, the Die Hard movies progressively get worse. Though I will say 3 is pretty good. And I actually like 4, but it's still, anyway, I could talk about that for hours. Anyway, but like it just keeps getting bigger, and that doesn't necessarily mean better. Like you're just getting an inflated budget. And in a weird sense, you almost kind of want to figure out a way, like get your budget to plateau and find a way to reinvent the wheel through that similar budget. In a weird sense, kind of what the Bond movies do. The Bond movies have always been big budget, but they never really, it doesn't ever feel like the producers are smart in knowing how much to spend, like, because there's very rarely been a flop. Like once you have a popular series like Bond, you can guarantee like a bare minimum of people going to see the movie. Just like with Final Fantasy, there's a bare minimum of people who are going to buy that game just because it's Final Fantasy. But anyway, that we could probably talk about this for hours. And you said you had an hour, and I've already taken an hour and 12 minutes of your time. So I want to wrap this up before we go into the shout outs. I end out all of my interviews. I normally do with 2 questions. We're going to skip one of them. But I will end it with questions from Courtney. Questions from Courtney. Da, 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 da. Courtney is my wife, as the listeners know, and infamously or famously, whatever you prefer, she knows absolutely nothing about video games, geek culture, anime, any of that stuff. And it's one of the many reasons I love her, because I always ask her for questions. She doesn't know what you do. She doesn't know what any of my guests do, and it makes it that much more interesting for me. So I always ask her to provide me with a question to ask you. And her question is, what is your preferred method of transportation?
Oh, trains. It's got it. Trains. Yeah. Goat form of travel. Best there
Dude,
is. No
I'm not
question.
even kidding. She asked me it before I came up here. I'm like, I would say cars, but that's just because of what I'm used to. But realistically, that's not, it's so boring. Like everyone has a freaking car. Trains. And I went with trains for the same thing. It's just it's
It's the
fun on
best.
obviously also much better for the environment.
Yeah. Exactly. It's sustainable. Like they can go long distances. Like they're fast. They're comfortable. I
Well,
just
not in
like
the
them.
US, where
Yeah,
our
well,
train
yeah, I
system
know.
is
My
freaking
experiences with
atrocious.
like European trains and stuff like that, and
Yeah.
where it's quite good. Yes, more France, less United States and Canada, but yeah, trains are great.
There we go. You heard it here first. Aiden's preferred method of transportation is trains. So let's wrap up this episode. Let's do plugs, shout outs. Where can people buy Fight Magic items? And then where can people find you online?
Yeah, so Fight Magic Items, it's from Running Press, which is a division of Hachette. So it can be found like anywhere on all the online bookseller sites, but more specifically at your indie bookstore. If they don't have copies, they can easily order a copy in. So go find an indie bookstore in your town and ask them to order one in. And I know for a fact that sometimes when people come in and they say, "Hey, can you order this book in for me?" They'll order a couple of copies for their shelves as well. So benefits everybody to support local indie stores, and it's a great way to buy smaller books like mine. as well. So that's where I try to push people. But if you get it from an online bookseller of questionable ethical fortitude, that's okay as well. It's available everywhere. You can find me online at a dribble of ink on Twitter. So that's ADRIBBLEOFINK. I'm there too much. I'm still there despite everything. But it is probably the best and most likely place to find me online. I have a website. If you Google me, there is a website for the book Fight Magic Items that I built at fightmagicitems.rocks. So Fight Magic Items rocks. You can find everything you need there. It's a one pager and it has everything from links to buy the book. It has review blurbs. It has links to other podcasts and interviews I've done, coverage of the book. Everything you could possibly need to know about the book is on there, and that might push you over the edge to pick it up. Or go to your library and request it as well. That's a good option.
It's funny, when we first started following each other on Twitter, I completely misread your Twitter handle until once we started talking to like figure out this interview. I looked into a dribble of ink and everything, but I always thought it said a dribble o fink,
Yeah.
and I'm like, I don't know what
Yeah.
that even means, but cool.
Well, I started it in 2007 or 2008 when I started a dribble of ink. Made a lot more sense when I ran a blog with the same name,
Oh
and
yeah.
that's what everybody knew me for. But unfortunately, my full name was long taken long ago. So I thought about changing it once or twice, but it is what it is.
Nah, I personally love the Twitter handles that make not I shouldn't say make no sense, but it's that are less I don't even want to say less professional. I mean, that might have sounded like a veiled insult, but like I like that it's not just somebody's name, because if it's just everyone's name, that's boring. I like that it's a little bit more personable when it's something that doesn't quite
Yeah.
add up to the person's real name. I always find that amusing.
I like that too. You'll find a celebrity or something, and their Twitter handle will be like Goku on a surfboard or whatever, and you're like,
Right.
okay, yeah, you can see the real person behind the celebrity. And
Exactly.
I
I
get a
always
kick out
find
of
that
that
type
too.
of thing
Yeah.
amusing. But okay, as for me, as usual, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StillLoadingPod on all of them. If you want to email me, you can email me stillloadingcontact@gmail.com. If you want to support the show, you can do it in a number of ways. You can give it a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or whichever podcasting app you use, because that helps more people find the show. It pleases the algorithm gods, and it makes me feel warm and fuzzy. I like feeling warm and fuzzy. And if you want to support the show monetarily, I've got a lot of cool stuff for you in return for your hard-earned money. For over on patreon.com/stillloadingpod for $1 a month, you'll get all the episodes a few days earlier at a better bit rate, as well as access to, well, I need to update it. It is a patron exclusive Discord, but I think I might change it to just my free Discord with patron exclusive channels and patron exclusive perks. But you also, for just $1 a month, can get polling privileges where I will set up a poll. I'm going to try to do it quarterly, where you can help pick an episode of the podcast. I'll choose 4 different games, and you can vote on to see which game I'm going to choose. The first poll, it ended up being oh my gosh, hold on, I'm completely blanking on the name. Spec Ops: The Line. I'm going to be covering Spec Ops: The Line on the show, and I'm going to be playing through it for the first time. I'm very much looking forward to it. That's for $1 a month. For $5 or $4 a month, you'll get everything at the $1 level plus 2 bonus episodes, which I recently started a series where I'm playing through one of those weird 220 game bootleg handheld consoles, and I'm torturing myself 8 games at a time. So you can check that out at the $4 level. And then last thing, the $5 level, you get everything I mentioned prior, to the bonus episodes, early access to the episodes, plus a patron exclusive podcast called Still Bonding, where my friend and I, Erica, bond over 007, make fun of it and all of its amazing goofiness, problematic issues, all you name it, it's all there in the James Bond series, and we love talking about it. So all that, patreon.com/stillloadingpod. But the most important shout out after that long-winded bit, the Bit by Bit Foundation. The Bit by Bit Foundation is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to put video games and video game consoles in the hands of kids receiving inpatient care at hospitals. So if you want to support them, go to bitbybitfoundation.org and consider donating. That is all I have for you for this episode of Still Loading. Aidan, thank you once again for joining me.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I love talking about this kind of stuff. I love revisiting not just the book and the work I put into it, but the genre with different people and different, like fans of games, whether it's Japanese RPGs or not. So it's always a pleasure to get to talk.
I really enjoyed talking to you too, man. I'm so happy to have you on, and I hope to have you on again if you'd be willing for anything. So that will do it for this episode of Still Loading. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you all next time.